we're recording. So thank you everyone for attending. Just a reminder, I'm Maddie, I'm the Skype Scientist intern. And today we have Tammy doing our ASL interpreting. Thanks, Tammy. And we also have Dr. Chris Baker on here with us today to talk about leeches, ants, and termites. Hey, Chris.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So yeah, I think basically what we'll start off is tell us a little bit about how you came to work with these organisms and kind of how you kind of give us your path on becoming a scientist.
Yeah, it was a long and meandering path, actually. I have some colleagues who they knew what they wanted to study and they went straight there, and I am not one of those scientists. So as an undergraduate in Australia, I studied biology and economics, and I spent a number of years working as an economist. Actually, I worked on credit cards and debit cards, and I worked for the Reserve Bank of Australia, which is like Australia's equivalent of the US Fed. And after a number of years, I decided to go back and pursue some research in biology. And I ended up on this project where the whole idea was to take economic theory and biology and use those things together to sort of look at the evolution and maintenance of mutualisms. So there's these arrangements where different species kind of cooperate to live. And from there, I worked on ants that defend the plants they live on from herbivores in Africa during my PhD. And from there, I moved to working on these termites that also live in Africa, in Kenya, where I worked. And they farm a fungus in these chambers underground. And so I worked on soil microbial ecology during my postdoc. And then most recently, I moved on to a project where we're interested in looking at animal biodiversity in Ailao National Park in China. And to do that, we're taking leeches that feed on blood, and we're sequencing the DNA from that blood from the leeches and using it to reconstruct a picture of biodiversity in the Ailao National Park. And that's where I'm at.
Wow. Yeah, that is like a pretty big jump. It's crazy that it almost like economics led you into biology, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, tell us a little bit more about maybe what you're finding with this. I've never heard of using blood from leeches to discover biodiversity in the areas.
Yeah, it's a really cool idea. So the whole use of leeches to survey biodiversity falls into this much larger field of eDNA, or environmental DNA. And so the idea is that if you go out there into the world, you can find DNA just lying around, and you can sequence it and read it and find out things about the world. And we're all familiar with this, actually. If you think about, the sort of crime shows that you watch on TV, and they sequence the DNA and they work out who the criminal is, it's exactly the same deal, except that we're using DNA from a national park to work out what animals were there previously, instead of, who robbed the bank. And so the idea is that, if you have an animal that's at your field site, think about a bobcat or a deer or a bear or something. And if you had a leech that fed on that animal, that leech is now going to contain the animal's blood, right? And so if we can capture the leech, we can extract the DNA from the gut of that leech, and we can sequence it, and then we can take that DNA sequence and we can look it up in a database that we have. And these databases are just on the internet, anyone can do this. And we can say, oh, this matches to a bear. And then we know that there was a bear that was at our field site. And because we know exactly where each leech was collected, we can sort of say not just, oh, it was somewhere in the park, but we can say, oh, it was exactly here. So
that's really cool. So then I guess, so leeches don't move around too much is kind of the analysis from that.
Yeah, we think they mostly kind of sit and wait for the next meal. They do move around a little bit, right? So we know that, if you've got a leech that's attached to an animal that's moving around, of course, it's going to be transported from one spot to another. There are records in the literature of leeches being found on birds. And of course, birds fly many kilometers. But we are assuming, of course, that, that movement is limited. And I think that makes the most sense, right? Even if you had a leech that was kind of attached to a bear and the bear kind of moved, a couple of miles before the leech dropped off, at least at the end of the journey, that bear was present at the place that we collected the leech. And so for us, that's that's probably the most important thing. And the sort of patterns that we're coming up with make sense, right? So, I know where all of the leeches were collected within the park. It's like this big, long, like 125 kilometers long, this park from one end to the other. And when I have a look at where all the different animals were found, we can sort of separate out sites according to, how close they were to the edge of the park, or how close they were to roads, or how high up the mountain they are. And what we find is that, in the low elevation areas close to the edge of the park, we got a lot of domesticated animals, cows that come in from the agricultural land outside the park. And, up in the higher elevation, more protected sites, that's where we find the more endangered animals, things like bears and, sort of small cats and rodents and things like that. And if the leeches were moving around a lot, we would expect that movement to sort of even out the diversity all over the park and remove that signal that we're seeing.
Gotcha. No, that's awesome. And we have a couple questions about the leeches themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Like, where do leeches, like, are leeches typically found in water? I feel like that's usually when I've heard of leeches, is like, don't go in this river.
Mm-hmm.
And how much blood can they drink a day?
Oh, that's a great question. Both of those are great questions. So there are actually lots of different species of leeches. I'm no leech expert, but my understanding is there's something like 700 different species of leech. Some of them live in salt water. Many of them, the majority of them, live in fresh water. So this is kind of probably where you've heard about, don't go in the water. But then probably 100 or so are what we think of as being terrestrial leeches. And of course, when we're sampling leeches, we're not randomly selecting from all of these different leech species. We're picking the ones that kind of come to us, as it were. And the reason for that is that we teamed up with the forestry rangers in this national park because we needed to collect a lot of leeches. And the most efficient way that we found to do that was to team up with the people who were already going out to do work in the park. And they literally just pull the leeches off their legs and stick them in tubes and give them to us. So our collections are very much skewed towards a couple of different species of leech that are basically terrestrial. They live on the land. So that was your first question, where are the leeches found, sort of thing. And then the second question was, sorry, can you remind me?
Oh yeah. How much blood do you think, like, on average, maybe just like average across species, or the kinds of species that y'all are typically finding?
Yeah, so the ones that we're finding range from maybe like half an inch or a centimeter long to, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 centimeters long. So you're really getting a couple of milliliters of blood in there. But leeches range in size really widely from, these little small things up to, I think the largest leech is something like, almost a foot long. Of course, we're not getting those in our tubes.
Yeah. Okay. So that sounds like it's pretty variable just based on size of leech.
Yeah. The other thing I should say is that, I said there are lots of different species of leech, and, I've sort of made it sound a little bit like they all feed on blood, and that's actually not the case. The ones that we catch, of course, are feeding on blood, but there's lots of leeches that they just feed on other insects that live in the water, or, that they actually kind of, will hunt them down, and sort of predate on them. So we're not capturing those leeches, but there's a really wide variety of biology within the leeches.
Gotcha. Very cool. And I guess, so since you were kind of describing, it doesn't sound like you necessarily do the field work yourself, but like, I guess I'm curious the kinds of field work that you have done, if you could kind of paint a picture of like what kind of stuff you've used and like what you've done out in the field studying either leeches, ants, or termites, whichever story you want to tell us.
Yeah, it's true. For this project, I was mostly based, I was doing a lot of statistical modeling work, and so our collaborators in China collected the leeches and did the lab work. The lab work the field work that I have done has mostly been in Kenya. So I mentioned that I worked on both ants and on termites, and actually, if you'd like, I can show you a couple of pictures of my field site in Kenya, if you'd like me to share my screen.
That would be cool. Let me, all panelists. Okay, it should be open.
Okay, let me see if I can do this. Can you see that there?
No, we can't. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Screen sharing has failed to start. Please try again later. That's okay. I can just go ahead and describe that, the field site. So let me start with the ants. So these ants, I had a couple of different projects, but one of the ones that I found was really interesting was looking at the communities of other insects and spiders and things that live on the trees alongside the ant colonies. So let me take a step back and explain the biology of these ants. This is sort of, this is the Kenyan savannas. It's like, semi-arid, dry grassland. And, imagine this landscape that's just got the same species of tree as far as the eye can see. 95% of the trees that you can see are the tree that I study, Vachellia drepanalobium or Acacia drepanalobium. And each one of these trees is covered with thorns, and it's covered with these little balls, which we call domatia. And what they are is they're hollow, swollen thorns. All right, these are little swellings that the plant grows, and ants live inside them. All right, so there's hundreds of these domatia, thousands of ants on every plant. And as you can imagine, this is Africa. So there's giraffe, there's rhinoceros, there's elephants, and all of these large mammals would love to knock over and eat the leaves off a plant. And so, the plants have teamed up, if you will, with these ants that live on the plant, and they defend their host trees, the trees that they live on, from these large mammals, which is, I find, amazing, right? Like, just imagine this huge elephant would love to eat this tree, and yet a colony of ants can kind of, scare it off. So the thing that was interesting to me was that there are actually a couple of different species of ant that live on these trees. Each tree has one ant colony on it, but different trees have different species. And I was interested in, what other things live on the trees. And what we found was that, depending on which ant species you have on the tree, you get a whole totally different community of spiders, a totally different community of like butterflies, totally different community of like scale insects that, also kind of herbivorize the tree. So what I was doing there was sort of going out and, finding trees, and I was collecting ants, and I was collecting just like all the other spiders and insects and things off the trees. And I would collect them into tubes. So we usually collect them into tubes full of ethanol or some other preservative. And I'm a molecular biologist. I do a lot of sequencing work. So for me that, I would collect hundreds of these samples, and then I'd get to take them back to the lab. And, much like the leeches, I would extract their DNA, and I could sequence it, and I could sort of ask, what is this species? But I could also ask questions like, where does this species come from? How closely is it related to the species that I find, 10 kilometers down the road?
Very cool.
Yeah.
And a question kind of off of that, someone's asking that they read, so I guess it's a statement, they're asking if it's true. I read that there are more species of ants on Earth than humans. Is that true?
Ooh.
I've definitely heard
are there more species? Are there more ants than humans? Is that the question?
I guess they're asking if there's more species of ants, but I bet the statement that I bet there's more ants than humans, but I don't know how many species of ants there are.
Yeah, I don't know I haven't done that calculation, but I could imagine that it would be true. There are many ants. I think there's something like 20,000 different species of ant. And they range widely in biology. You can imagine with so many different species, there's like a lot of variation. Some of the most, and the colonies range widely in sizes. So, here in New England, we get these little temnothorax ant colonies, and the entire colony lives inside a single acorn. All right, so you've just got a couple of dozen workers in there. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have these huge colonies that occupy, big subterranean mounds that would have millions and millions of workers in there. And of course, everything kind of in between. I could imagine that there would be more ants than humans on the planet.
Yeah, that's true. I definitely heard about there being more beetles than humans. So
That's probably true. Yeah. Yeah. You hear some really cool numbers. And, of course, it's hard to measure these things. One number that I've heard is that, if you go to a tropical rainforest, something like 1/3 of the biomass in the rainforest is like ants. Um,
yeah, no, that makes sense. There's
an
definitely
animal
a
or
lot.
insect biomass, I should clarify.
Yeah, no, that's awesome.
Mm,
And if someone else has a question, they're really interested in kind of your path to science. And I think,
yeah.
like, I know you talked to us a little bit about that, but if you wouldn't mind kind of elaborating on that switch from economics to biology a little bit more.
Yeah. So I would love to say it was all carefully planned, but it really wasn't. Um, and I started off, I actually always thought that I was going to be a scientist. That's what I thought that was going to happen when I was an undergraduate. But I ended up working for the Reserve Bank also kind of, for slightly random reasons. I thought that I saw an internship and went and did it for a summer and loved it. And the work was interesting. The people were great. And, I ended up kind of working there on some super interesting projects, some public policy work. And my move back to science was really almost as accidental. I was interested in moving overseas at the time. And so I was looking around for a way to go back to science and do some research. And looking around on the internet, I saw a project that was advertised, a group of researchers, partly at Harvard where I did my PhD, but also at a bunch of other institutions, had pulled in a grant. And the idea was to take economic theory and try and use it to make sense of mutualism in biology, and to give you a sense of the sort of thing that we wanted to do. There are lots of biological arrangements that you might think of as being a little bit like economic arrangements. Like if you think about, say the kind of contract that you have with an employer and an employee. The employer perhaps pays the employee to do a job, but then, the employer can't sit around watching the employee all day. And so, how do you know whether the employee is putting in the full number of hours, or how do you know that they're working hard, or how do you know that you even have a good quality employee in the first place? And so there's a lot of economic theory dedicated to the question of, if you were an employer, how would you write a contract, right? Like, for example, would you make somebody's salary or their wage depend on a good job being done at the end of the day, right? And so we wanted to sort of see, well, could you think about, say, the ants, the plants in a similar kind of way? Like if you think of the trees as being like an employer and the ants as being like an employee, like what would happen, for example, if the ants did a bad job at getting rid of elephants, right? Like could the tree produce fewer of those demetia for the ants to live in? Could the tree produce less food for the ants to eat? Like, would that be a way of kind of like, it's like reducing salary or reducing wages for a worker? So anyway, we were interested in exploring the connections between economics and biology. And of course, there's lots of these sorts of connections between different fields. And so I moved over to Boston and started working on this project. And one thing led to another. As you yourself know, I think, during a PhD, you encounter lots of different projects and, different things take your interest. There happened to be a guy, Dino Martins, who's from Kenya, who was also a PhD student in the same lab and who worked on these trees and these ants. He's also an entomologist. And he had some interesting observations that he didn't have time to finish off in his PhD. He had made some observations of one particular ant species farming a fungus inside some water tubes that he'd given them. And so I just happened to be around and I was like, oh, that's something that's super interesting to me. And, I picked that up and, the rest of it is history, I guess.
That's awesome. I like the idea of like a social contract between the trees and the ants, like making sure they're doing a good job. And yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. Like many things, I think the analogy is not necessarily perfect, but I think it's useful to sort of say, oh, here's an idea from economics. I wonder what useful parts we can pull out and use in biology.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And kind of jumping, so people have some questions about ants in general.
Okay.
Do you know, yeah, do you know like the lifespan of like maybe the ants that you were working with? Like, and maybe what the most dangerous ant is as like a fun fact.
Oh, I don't know what they're both good questions. The lifespan of an individual ant. I mean, so if you think about an ant colony, there's there's a queen, and then there's lots of workers. The lifespan of an individual worker is probably pretty short. They're exposed to lots of sort of dangers. They could, if they an ant worker could well be kind of killed defending the tree from an elephant. But from the ant colony's point of view, the really important thing, because the queen is the only individual in the whole colony that lays eggs and kind of gives rise to new workers. The really important thing is kind of how long does that colony last for? And I don't know that we have the answer for my species or for many species, but many years is the answer. And then in terms of what's the most dangerous ant, well, I mean, I think if you've ever been, there are some ants that kind of, bite or sting and it's not too bad. I mean, I don't know what the most dangerous one is, but I can certainly remember, going and doing field work in Australia. And there were four of us in the car, and, I was sitting in the back seat. I kind of looked down at my shirt and I saw this bull ant. It's, maybe an inch and a half long. And I just casually said to these other guys in the in the car, oh, there's like a bull ant on my shirt. And I've never seen four guys get out of a car so quickly in my life. I think they can give you a pretty nasty bite.
They just abandoned you. You were just sitting there with this ant.
I was just like, I have this ant on my shirt. Can someone help me?
That's funny.
Yeah.
And someone in the chat is mentioning the bullet ant in South America too, which
Yeah.
I haven't been bit by one of those, but I've seen them, and they also scare me a little bit too. No, none of them were ever crawling on me, so I was safe.
Yeah, actually, the bullet ant is another one of these kind of like large ants that I've never been, bitten. I've never touched one either, but apparently it's pretty painful. Well, one of the interesting things with these different ants is it's not always the biggest ant with the biggest sting or the biggest bite that kind of wins out in nature, because often you get small ants that they team up. And actually the bull ant that I sort of saw on my t-shirt or on my shirt in Australia, it's actually pretty common for those really big ants to be completely outnumbered and overpowered by little tiny ants just by sheer numbers.
Yeah, no, that's good. So maybe, yeah, just if you see an ant on you, ask someone around, and if they get scared, it might be.
Exactly.
That's awesome. And also, I guess some questions about. Oh, we just got a new one. So after ants bite, it's not similar to bees, correct? Like, well, because it's like bees are stinging and it's losing the stinger, versus ants can kind of bite as much as they need to defend, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And some ants, I should say, some ants do sting as well. But I'm not aware of any of them kind of being a one-shot thing. I think they can sting multiple times.
Gotcha. And then the question I was going to ask before is, we've also got some questions about how long are leech lifespans as well as termites.
I don't know about the leeches. I'm not sure. I mean, these leeches that we collect, we know that they kind of, sit around and feed for, and kind of wait for months for the next meal. So that kind of gives you a sort of sense of like the lower limit, but I'm not sure, kind of how long they could be lived. These termites, much like the ants, it's often useful to think in terms of the lifespan of the colony rather than kind of, any individual worker. And we know that these colonies probably last for decades. What is harder to know is whether, so you can kind of go back decades in the records and sort of find, there was a termite colony occupying this exact same spot, 50 years ago, and the evidence is that termite mound was exactly the same termite mound as you're sort of seeing now. What's unknown, I think, for the most part, is whether, that mound kind of, maybe a colony died off and was replaced by another one. It's just been the same mound that's been kind of occupied for the last, 50, 100 years, or whether it's like exactly the same colony. Yeah, but a long time. I mean, and ecologically that's important, right? Because, these things, these insects have important ecological effects, and those ecological effects kind of persist for decades at a time.
Yeah, no, that's pretty cool. And a question off of that is like, so you were mentioning that I guess the leech project is kind of, maybe it's starting to wrap up, and I was curious if you have any new projects that you're interested in talking with us about.
Yeah, we're interested in we're interested in what we can do with the leeches going forward. So, what we did with the leeches was to use the blood meals from the leech guts to look at vertebrate biodiversity. There's some more recent work from other researchers where they use those same blood meals to look at the presence of pathogens, bacteria or viruses, that kind of thing in the blood meal, and that I think is a really interesting area. So we know that we can detect those viruses and bacteria. It'd be really cool, obviously we're, being in the middle of a global pandemic, like, there's lots of people kind of thinking about disease, and particularly zoonotic disease. So disease that sort of comes from wild animals and can be passed into animals, into humans. In many cases, we have a good idea of what diseases are out there and how they get passed around. And in those cases, I think that there are good ways to go out and survey those diseases, right? Like if you know that the disease is basically passed through mosquitoes, you can go and trap a whole bunch of mosquitoes. But there are some diseases where we don't have a good sense of what the vertebrate reservoir is, or we don't have a good sense of what diseases might be out there that don't yet affect humans, but that, like a small change could like kind of lead to it being a zoonotic, disease. And I think kind of using leeches to sort of explore that would be interesting. So I'm kind of interested in working up some of that as future directions.
Very cool. And I guess, so we have a question off of that. Is there a disease, like maybe like an example of a disease that's come from leeches to humans, or is there not one?
I can't think of any really good examples. Like, surprisingly, there aren't a lot of diseases that, as far as I know, that we think of as sort of coming from leeches to humans. I don't know exactly why that is. So we know that viruses and bacteria and other pathogens like protozoans can survive in the leech gut for months at a time, and some of those diseases are in fact human pathogens. So I remember reading something about HIV, for example, being sort of pulled out, or hepatitis being pulled out of leeches. But I'm not aware of a lot of evidence of that sort of those diseases ending up being passed on to humans. One possibility for that is that it may be like a lot of diseases that we kind of get through a vector, or through through like a biting insect or something like that, are diseases that have evolved to replicate in the vector, in the mosquito, for example, as well as kind of to infect some mammalian host, maybe humans, maybe, deer, or something like that. And evolving that capacity to replicate in a couple of different hosts is tricky, right? Like, you sort of need some specialization in order for that to happen. Leeches tend to be, these leeches that we work on tend to be generalists, right? Like they feed on a lot of different mammals, and it might just be the case that the pathogens that they kind of end up hosting inside them just like never really get enough time to kind of with any one particular mammalian host to evolve that capacity. That's my hypothesis.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. That's cool. And I guess a little off of the, like, just talking about the leeches a little more, are the leeches that I guess you mentioned studying a lot of different species, but are there any like invasive leeches that are in the area that you're working in, or in general maybe?
I don't know. I'd have to defer that one to a leech specialist, I think. The leeches that we end up collecting, I think, tend to be a fairly narrow selection. Um, if we didn't sequence all of our leeches. We didn't, we had 30,000 of them, so we weren't going to go through and identify every single one. But as a similar, a study that did a similar thing, in a slightly different area, but a similar sort of rainforesty, habitat, was basically getting two different species of leech. So it's likely that any sorts of invasives are not being picked up in our data set.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure like how much of your like leech project you're able to share,
Hmm.
but have you found any cool like species in the area that maybe you didn't expect just because you were able to sequence the blood from the leeches?
Yeah, so I've got sort of two answers to that. One is, yeah, like there's actually kind of a bunch of stuff that we were pleasantly surprised to see in there. We saw a lot of things that we weren't very surprised to see, but weren't that thrilled. Like, there's a lot of domesticated cattle. There's a lot of really common deer. But in this national park, there's also a lot of, like amphibians, frogs, and newts and that kind of thing that have endangered or threatened status. And we weren't really sure whether we would be able to find them in our data set. Like, we weren't really sure whether we would see them in this national park at all. Like, we knew that they were there at some stage in the past, but we didn't know their current status. And so it was good to be able to see those in our data set. That was pleasing. The other sort of part of my answer, I think, kind of, I should sort of perhaps explain a little bit about how this work kind of proceeds, right? So we have tens of thousands of leeches, and you extract DNA in a laboratory, or perhaps even taking a step back from that, we have all of these leeches. They're collected by park rangers who are just stuffing them into tubes while they're doing other things. There's a lot of kind of cross contamination, and or at least the potential for a lot of cross contamination. Then we have to kind of work these things up in the lab and do our sequencing. And one of the things that we're always concerned about in this sort of environment where there could be contamination from, either in the lab or in the field, is the possibility of misidentifications, right? Like, we don't want to sort of say, oh, like this endangered frog is here when it's really not there, right? Like, that gives us a false sense of confidence about what things are being protected well by the park. And so we erred on the conservative side. We decided to that anything that we would mostly restrict our attention to things that were already known to be in the park, on the assumption that anything that was kind of, had never been seen in this park before was probably either a mistake in the identification or it was a contamination. You could always relax that, but you'd have to be extra careful that you weren't kind of drawing incorrect conclusions.
Cool. And then someone had a really cool question that I don't even know. Can leeches bite other leeches and take their blood?
Ooh, that would be really cool if they could.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, leeches have a wide variety of biology. Like I said, some of them are predatory. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there are leeches that attack other leeches.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And then another leech question, do you know, like, can they see in color? And like a follow-up, do they rely on sight a lot, or is it much more they're just kind of waiting and then they can maybe just smell the animal?
Yeah, I think of them, again, not being really a leech biologist, I think of them as being animals that are much more reliant on, smell or taste or whatever you want to call it. Perhaps temperature, if I had to guess, in order to sort of seek out their meal. I mean, you can sort of pick up a leaf or something with a leech on it, and you kind of see the end waving around in the air, presumably sensing gradients in, molecules, like smelling, if you like. I don't know whether there's any kind of vision, but I don't think of them as being visual creatures.
Yeah, I'm like I have a vision of like what a leech looks like. I don't even know if I've seen
Yeah.
eyes on them.
If I had to guess, I would guess that maybe they could sense like light from dark or something, because you could imagine that would be useful in, finding your way, I don't know, like to the surface of the water or something. But I don't know. It's a guess.
Gotcha. Cool.
Mm.
And then so when we're talking about like more stuff about leeches, because I think this is really a cool topic.
Mm.
Are leeches typically different colors, or are they always kind of that dark brownish black?
They do come in different colors, but I think I've never seen, a blue leech but yeah, you get them that's sometimes patterned in different colors. We get the charismatically colored brown leech called brown leech, but there's another species that they call the tiger leech that kind of has a little bit of patterning, but we're not talking like orange and black stripes. We're talking, there's a little bit of shading difference here.
So mostly kind of that brownish color, but that's cool that there's a variation in the patterns at least.
Yeah.
Cool. Let me look through. I guess I'm also curious, like we're also curious about, I think we haven't heard as much about your termite work. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to have another go at sharing this screen because I think it's really
I
cool.
hope
Is that all right?
Yeah.
I don't know whether I just sort of hit the wrong button or something.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
And let me view options.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the landscape that I was trying to describe for you before. This is the this is the Kenyan savanna where I work, and these trees are the trees that I was describing as being kind of covered with those ants. You can see the little kind of balls, the little demacia that I was trying to describe as being the homes for the ants. But you asked about termites, so obviously above ground you can see a lot of different trees filled with occupied by these ants. What you don't see is what's going on below ground. Because the termites that I work on build these enormous subterranean or underground nests. So you can see in the top left there, one of my field assistants, Eshakan, he's crouching on top of a termite mound. The termites that I work on are in the genus Odontotermes. And there's not much to see above ground. You can see in the photo in the center where without the person, there's almost no difference in the grass. But if you have a look at in the bottom, this black and white photograph from one of Joe Darlington's papers, there's a guy sort of standing in that hole for scale, and you can see that the mound goes several feet down into the ground. So the cool thing about these termites, and one of the reasons they're able to build such large nests, is that they farm fungus. Right. So the photo that I'm showing you there it's my hand holding a piece of fungal comb. Right. So what these termites do is they go out into the savanna around their nest, and they bring back dead plant material, grass or wood, and they feed it to this symbiotic or mutualistic fungus. Right. And you can see these little white nodules all over the fungal comb. They're little bits of fungus that are growing and digesting the plant material, and that's what the termites eat. And for most animals, grass and wood and that sort of thing is not a really good source of food. But much like us, if you can kind of turn it into a mushroom, the mushrooms are a much more digestible food source. And so these termites, by virtue of kind of like living this lifestyle where they can eke out a living from this arid, fairly sparse savanna. And those nests end up being productivity hotspots. And you can see this most clearly if in satellite imagery. So the picture that I'm showing you there, each of these little small dots is a termite mound. So there's a couple of things you can see. One is that they're just like everywhere. They're just like they cover the savanna. And then the other thing that you can see is they're really evenly spaced out, right? And so, the technical term for this is overdispersion. They're overdispersed. In other words, they're more evenly spaced out than you would expect by random chance, right? And some of my colleagues have done some really cool work explaining why it is that they're so evenly spaced out. But what I was interested in was what are the kind of ecological what are the kind of the ecological implications of these termite mounds, right? So I said that these termite mounds were productivity hotspots. And actually, let me just unshare my screen so you can see me again now.
We can still see the screen.
Yeah, let me hit the right button.
Okay.
So I said that they're productivity hotspots. So what does that mean? There's higher soil nutrients, so there's more nitrogen, there's more phosphorus, there's more potassium in the soil. There are more insects close to mounds. You get sort of stronger sort of growth of plants, on the mounds compared to the land further away. And we're kind of interested in like, what are the implications of that? What does that mean? So, one of the questions that, a colleague was interested in, it was, how much more time do grazing animals like antelopes spend on mounds where the grass is better versus off mounds where the grass is less good? So I was interested in the soil nutrient cycling, and I was interested in how the communities of bacteria and fungi in the soils looked close to mounds versus further away from mounds. And the way that I addressed this was to, again, kind of use DNA sequencing. So what I did was I went out to the field in Kenya and I collected soil samples, both from on mounds and from further away from mounds. And I sequenced the DNA from the bacteria and the fungi in the soils. And I just asked, like, how many species of bacteria are here versus off the mounds? And then I asked, what species of bacteria and fungi are here on the mounds versus off the mounds? And what we found was that these termite mounds, they have more species of bacteria than the surrounding grassland. We also just found that they have different species of bacteria and fungi than the surrounding grassland. And then we sort of followed that up with some experimental work. So one of our co-authors did some work looking at that. He just measured enzymatic activity levels. So basically kind of, the rate at which bacteria were able to metabolize substrates within the soil, and showed that, the microbes close to mounds just performed differently than the ones off the mound. But this sort of left us with some open questions, right? Because, we didn't really know, just from what I just told you, that the termites were actually causing the differences in the microbial communities, right? And this is, of course, like one of these really important things in biology, like just because or in science in general, like just because you see a pattern, doesn't tell you what caused the pattern, right? It could have been that the bacteria were different and then the termites moved in afterwards, but you didn't know. And so what we did was, after sort of finding this pattern, these different bacteria on and off the mounds, we did an experiment to try and show that it was the termites themselves that were causing the pattern. And we did this in what was a fairly simple but hopefully interpretable way. So we started off, we knew that there was more nitrogen and more phosphorus and more potassium close to mounds. And so we just said, okay, what would happen if we went to a different part of the savanna where there are no termites, and then we just add nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium? Can we recreate the differences in the microbial communities? And what we found was that we could, in fact, actually recreate the differences in fungi and fungal communities, but we actually we created the opposite differences in bacterial communities. So this is sort of ongoing work, but what we conclude from that is that, we still think that the termites are causing the differences in the soil microbial communities, but what we know now is that it's not just because of the sort of elevated nutrient levels that they cause. There must be some other explanation. And we think that it's got a lot to do with the acidity of the soil. And this will kind of have to be something that we follow up in future work.
Yeah, that's really cool. And we now have a couple of like some termite biology questions.
Okay.
Just so like a clarification, so termites eat wood, or do they just, or they do? Okay, cool.
Well, sorry, was that was the question?
Yeah.
Or so many termites eat wood. Some we think of as being like soil feeders.
Mm.
you know, as in they kind of ingest soil, but of course, like in soil, there's like little organic particles, and you know, that's what they're digesting. But yeah, not all of them will kind of like burrow into wood or anything like that. Of course, the ones that I worked on really are kind of fungus feeders rather than kind of wood feeders. You know, they probably do go and sort of chew up wood to some extent, but they're probably also just collecting fallen timber or like, you know, little bits of grass litter.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, because that's what I was picturing is most like
Mhm.
I feel like termites maybe in the US typically eat wood and then but yeah, that makes sense that not everyone would.
Mm.
And then another question, so like do termites have queens just like ants?
Yep, yep, they do. Termites have a queen and they have a king, actually.
Oh, cool.
So unlike ants, where you know you have a queen and the queen mates with a male, but then the male kind of, you know, the males die and the queen goes and starts a new colony. In termites, the king and the queen both sort of go and they start a colony together. Um, and that means that, you know, they can kind of continue to sort of fertilize and kind of, you know, produce eggs for some time. Um,
Cool.
yeah.
And then another termite question. So when you showed that photo of you holding some of those, like those termites looked really small. Is that
Mm.
about the average size of termites, or are there like really large ones also?
There are really large ones. So there are the ones that I showed you on my hand are kind of like that. What you saw there was you know, a couple of really small workers. The Even within that species, there are larger individuals. The queen, of course, tends to be larger. You know, at my field site, there are other species, including, so I worked on a species called Odontotermes. There's another species, Macrotermes, and as you might guess from the name, you know, macro, you know, the queen is really large. Like, you know, I don't know if you can get the scale, but you know, probably a good like 4 or 5 inches long, and you know, sort of thicker than my finger, kind of thing. Yeah, they're pretty impressive.
Gotcha. So it's mostly like variation within species where the queens are really large, but the workers are typically smaller.
That is a pretty consistent and large difference, but there is a lot of variation between species as well.
Okay, gotcha.
Mm.
And then some follow-ups on,
Mm.
so do queens have wings? Um, and then I'll just add another one in there. So you mentioned too that a single king and queen start a
Yeah.
brand new nest also.
I I think that is an aspect of the biology that varies between species. I'm not in a good position to kind of give you a sense of like what the distribution of that. I'm sort of looking at my other screen here because I actually do have a photo of some dispersing uh, soon to be queens. So let me share you this screen because I kind of like this little video.
Cool.
Can you see that?
It's not full screen. Oh, now it's full screen.
Okay. So this is just like a little photo, like a video that I took, and you can just see out of these holes, which are, you know, kind of leading to an underground termite mound. There are just like hundreds of these little winged alates kind of pouring out. The video's a bit jerky. I'm sorry about that. I don't know if you sort of got a good sense of that, but like, let me kind of rewind the video to that spot. So, you know, you can see. I just stop it at roughly that point. I mean, you can kind of get a sense of like these small individuals in the center of the shot and kind of near the hole are probably about the same size as the one that I had on my hand in that other photo. And then, you know, this large winged individual, that would be a dispersing, we call them alate, you know, a dispersing reproductive. And with any luck, that winged reproductive will kind of go on to start a new colony. But I say, you know, with any luck, because like there are thousands and thousands of these winged reproductives that kind of fly out of the nest in the hope of starting a new colony. And the vast majority of them, of course, don't make it. And one of the kind of most amazing things is seeing thousands of these reproductives leaving the nest, and then just, you know, surrounding the nest, there are birds and like you know, mongooses and things just kind of sitting there and trying to get a good meal out of all of these termites.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you for showing that video.
Yeah, no problems. I
And
hope the
we have
quality of that was okay. It was a little bit
Oh
jerky on
yeah,
my
no worries. I honestly didn't know what they looked like with wings, so that was really cool.
end. Hmm.
And we have one more question. Oh, I guess
Yeah.
we do these two more questions, and then we're
Okay.
gonna go into the last little couple Skype of scientist ones.
Okay.
So back about the wings, will
Yeah.
smaller termites eventually form wings, or they're kind of like winged ones and wingless ones?
There are winged ones and there are wingless ones. So most same thing with ants. Like most workers in the colony do not reproduce ever. Like they're workers and they may kind of pick and choose different tasks to perform during their lives, but they by and large are never going to go on and leave the nest and fly and reproduce. Um, and so the ones that you see that do have wings, they are sort of raised and they're physiologically different. Like they're often large. The females are often kind of like larger and um, that's all they do. They kind of get raised, and when they leave the nest they go out and they fly, and their mission is to go and try and make a new colony.
Gotcha. Cool. And then one more kind of about, and maybe you did say this already, but just a reclarification. So how do
Yeah.
the termites feed the fungi in their nest?
Yeah, so what they do is you have workers that go out and they forage on plant material, all right? And obviously termites don't really have hands, so they can't just like, it's not like they're carrying it back. So what they're doing is they're actually just like ingesting it. They're swallowing it. It kind of ends up in their gut, and then they kind of come back to the nest, and then they take a few bites of this fungus, and so you can kind of imagine in their gut, it's like you've got fungus and the wood or grass or whatever it is that they've just collected is all kind of like mixing up, and then they literally go and poop it onto the fungal comb. All right, so then you've kind of got this mix of plant material, undigested plant material, and fungal material. And of course, the fungus is still alive, and so it just kind of grows throughout the comb. And then at some later point, a termite can kind of come back and consume the fungus to eat it for nutrition, or can kind of eat it and mix it with new plant material to kind of keep the fungal comb going.
Wow, yeah, that's really cool, and a great question to end the little Q&A part. So yeah,
Okay.
thank you. That was awesome, and thanks
Hmm.
everyone for all your great questions. And then the last three ones that we usually end with. The first one being, is there one thing that you wish that you were asked today?
Oh, I don't know. That's a great question. I hadn't thought about that. I don't know. Like, I'm glad that I hope that I was able to kind of answer people's questions when it came to kind of how I came to be a scientist. I mean, I think that there's like there's lots of different ways that we can kind of come to do this. It's not like there's one particular life path that all sorts of people end up being scientists. I could have talked a little bit more about sort of conservation. I think there are lots of different topics. Another thing that I think is kind of really important to talk about is like how we do science and how we form scientific communities. What sort of we've sort of heard a lot about kind of diversity and equity. That sort of thing would have been kind of an interesting thing to talk about, and perhaps is something that we could talk about in the future.
Yeah, that would be awesome. And I mean, I guess this kind of leads into the next question is there like a fun fact about your topic or your research, or like something about what you do that you'd want to share with us?
Oh, I mean, there's so many aspects of what I do that I enjoy. I enjoy going to the field. I enjoy doing lab work. I enjoy sitting at the computer and kind of analyzing data. And I like I said, I think that I think all sorts of people can be scientists, and for different reasons. I also think that science is something that whether you're a scientist or not, science is something that we as members of the public can and should be engaged in, right? Like, you could go and be a member of like a natural history society, or just as a member of the public. Like, you can read stuff that scientists have written. You can sort of think critically about kind of different kind of scientific arguments that are being made. And I guess I would encourage everyone to sort of think about how they engage with science in any of these ways.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm,
and I mean, shameless plug for Skype a Scientist. That's like our whole thing is we're trying to
right.
connect members of society just to like know what kind of science is out there and like see. I think it's really cool to learn about everyone's paths. Like everyone can become a scientist in a different way, and
Hmm.
being a scientist doesn't mean like white lab coat and like using one of those like pipettes. There's like lots of different things you can do. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, that's really cool. Even though I do like pipetting things, I think.
There is a certain satisfaction in it.
Yeah, and the last question that we're going to kind
Yeah.
of end on is really open. So it's like, is there something that you want to share about anything? Just to kind of like something you could transmit to the world, like a really cool fun fact, or just something you really care about, or yeah, anything you want to share with us to kind of wrap up today.
Oh, um, I don't know. I mean, I think I kind of like largely, kind of touched on some of the things that that I thought were important in a couple of the other questions. I guess I'd sort of end again, sort of encouraging everyone to kind of think about how they engage with science, and it doesn't mean that you have to go out and be a white lab coated scientist. I think you can kind of be a scientist, engage with science as a kind of, even for in your spare time or kind of from outside the profession. And I hope that what we've talked about today is of interest to people. And that just perhaps inspires them to think about what things they might kind of find interesting themselves in science in the future.
Yeah, no, the just knowing that there is like a lot, there was many species of leeches that I did not know
Mm,
existed, and the fact that some just eat insects, yeah, that was really cool in and of itself. So I think today was awesome, and yeah,
cool.
thank you for coming on today and talking with
No
us.
problems. Thanks for
And
having me on.
yeah, and thanks Tammy for translating for us. And thank you all the participants for your wonderful questions. Tomorrow we have a session talking way different topic. We're going to be talking about environmental engineering. So hopefully everyone can join again. And yeah, thanks again, Chris. It was great.
Great. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, everyone have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.